Hi, everyone. God, I forgot what I sound like on a microphone. You know, when you hear yourself talk, sometimes you just think, like, that can't be me. You know? I think I have this sort of medium voice, and then I hear myself, I sound like this. Anyways, hi, how is everybody? Good afternoon, and welcome to the last session of the day. Hopefully you stay awake for at least 30 minutes of this. Afterwards, I don't care if you fall asleep. I don't blame you. I put myself to sleep putting it together. So, and you're probably going, what in the heck is X++? First of all, just quick show of hands. Does anybody know what X++ is? Excellent. I love it. Good. That means that I can fill your brains full of stuff and you're like, well, it's cool. Well, hopefully. First of all, turn this on. Maybe. Yeah, okay. So my name is Brent Dawson. I'm originally from Canada. I moved to London almost exactly 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years ago, March 4th. The best time to move, if I can ever tell anybody to move, is in the middle of a pandemic because nobody else is doing anything. I flew on a 787 Dreamliner from Toronto to London. There were 25 people on the plane. I had the entire back half from like row 30 to the end all to myself. It was great. I did ask the flight attendant if I could sit in first class because it would the only time I'd ever be able to do that. And she smiled at me quite wryly and said, no, we have to worry about weight distribution. And I'm like, I know I'm a bit overweight, but come on now. I've been in IT for 34 years. I started when I was 17. I started playing with computers when I was in grade 2, which was 1977. Commodore CBM, if you know what those are, precursors to the PETs. And I've also been a Microsoft trainer for the last 25 years. So I've taught pretty much everything Microsoft has ever created, everything from C# to VB and all that sort of stuff, and all the way through to what I'm going to talk to you about today. My current role is a pre-sales architect. I'm a solutions and enterprise architect at DXC Technology in the Microsoft Business Application Stack, primarily in Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. And X++ is the language that's used to develop that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm also currently working on my master's in data sciences from the University of Sunderland. And I've forgotten how hard university work is after not doing it for 34 years or 32 years. And I'm also going to plug myself. I'm also writing a book on solution architecture for finance and supply chain management. So if that interests you, it's on Amazon. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start by taking a look at the tool itself. So the tool is called Dynamics. Okay, and it has a bit of a history. It's been around since the mid 90s, 95, I think, is when it was sort of first created, and it was a conglomeration of a company called Extapa Business Management Solutions, which was based out of Denmark, and IBM. So they created this first sort of ERP system to integrate, finance and supply chain and that sort of stuff. It was very basic. It was obviously version 1 of software. In 1995, you had basically Windows NT4 as your operating system that you could run it on. So it wasn't overly complicated, but for the time, it was probably one of the more advanced pieces of software that was available in line with things like SAP. The original programming language of Extapa was based on Morphex. Okay? It's actually a sub-flavor of Java, and we'll get into that in a minute. But it was it's designed in such a way that it takes advantage of a lot of the .NET feeling and capabilities that C# and Java have in their languages. In 2002, Microsoft took over Extapa, and from there, fully brought it into the .NET framework. And version 4, which was in 2002, is the first version that actually implemented the full .NET stack. So all of the components and capabilities that .NET had to provide. And it was also the first version that introduced something called an AOT, which stands for Application Object Templates. And this is the environment that you will actually go in and build all of the code that you're going to do the application or build the application. One of my previous jobs, or incantations of myself, because I've gone through many, I was the full-time Dynamics administrator at an international airport in Canada. And I was there for 6 years. And it took till literally 3 months before I left to get the director of IT to understand that this wasn't a piece of software that you went out, installed, and ran ax.exe. It wasn't as simple as that there was all this other stuff, and he could never understand why I would have to take an outage and do a compile and then a build and then a deploy and blah, blah, blah. He couldn't grasp that. And so it was just because it's a very large application that allows you to do a number of different things. And so you needed to be able to run it like a regular piece of software that you would build from scratch in your own organization. We'll talk about that in a minute. So as I mentioned, it's a superset of Java. It contains a lot of the Java functionality. Of course, that's a lot like the C# functionality that we have as well. In many ways, it acts a little bit like Link, if you remember what Link is and was when Microsoft was really pushing that a few years ago. Most of the commands that it uses are directly SQL queries, but in a Java-styled structure, right? So as an example, an insert record set is the equivalent of a SQL insert. And the same goes for updates and deletes and so forth. So really what you're doing is that you're writing code that lives inside a SQL server, right? So if you think about how you normally write software, you would write a piece of code, you'd create a library or a DLL file or whatever it is, and you'd install it onto the system, and then you would link to it, and you'd execute some code against it. In this scenario, all of the code that you're building is actually installed and put into a table in a SQL server. So there's no physical layer of application that you're working with. It's all virtualized inside of a SQL database. So really what you're doing is much like when you have SharePoint and you put a PDF file in it, it converts it to a very large binary number, stores it in the SQL database, and then makes it retrievable so you can work with it. In 2002, when Microsoft took it over, it started its integration with Visual Studio. So there are 2 or 3 different versions of the X++ language. So as I mentioned previously, the original one was based on MorphX. Microsoft took it over and said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. We're now going to base it on like a Java platform. We're going to base it on the .NET framework. And the advantage of that, of course, is that it gives you all of the same capabilities that just about every other language that supports the framework has. And of course, the advantage of that then is that it allows you to use connectors from other programming languages to communicate with Dynamics. So as an example, if I have an application that's written in a mainframe, let's say, okay, and I'm going to do, I need to connect some data that's in the mainframe to Dynamics. How am I going to get it from there to there? Well, I'm going to have to create an integration, okay? So how am I going to create that integration? Well, chances are I'm going to create some sort of custom service that I can run that will communicate between the mainframe system and the AX Dynamics system, right? Well, that's probably going to be written in C# or C++. So if Dynamics couldn't support those languages and be able to interact with those languages, we'd never be able to transfer data between different systems. And so this capability using Visual Studio is the advantage that we have. The newest version of this, and you may have heard of this, is called Dynamics 365. It was released in about the mid-O's, 2007-ish, something like that. Or sorry, the 10s, so about 2012. And it completely forced you to do everything in Visual Studio, okay? Now, we'll talk about Visual Studio in a bit, but the way that it actually does some coding in it is kind of unique, and it's a bit strange, but you'll see what I mean when I get there. There are a whole bunch of new language features, including things like being able to declare variables anywhere, the extensions of the data, and being able to extract core code components and extend them. The way that Dynamics is built, because it's a cloud-based application, everybody that uses the application shares the same code base, okay? So when you buy Dynamics, you get whatever the release version is. I think it's right now, it's 10.0.42. And that they do patches on a monthly basis, and they do 2 wave releases twice a year. But because everybody is using the same code base, My code and your code have to work together, okay? So in AX, because it was on-prem and everything was done locally, I could mess around and bug around with it all I wanted to, and I could do all sorts of customizations, and I could change forms and do this and do that. And I literally had the ability to go in and open up the engine, look at the code, and modify the code to fit what I needed it to do, compile it, build it, do the deployment, everything was gravy, okay? But when I'm sharing code, I can't do that. So what I have to do is I have to create extensions of those existing items. So as an example, if I have a sales order form that has a bunch of fields on it, and for my particular implementation, I need to have an extra field that specifies a date conversion, let's say, because North America is one date format, the UK is another date format, and I need something to just say that what the base format is. Well, that doesn't exist in the form and in the database by default. Because, again, everything is shared, I can't go in and actually just change the form. I have to go into Visual Studio, I have to open the form, and I create an extension of that form that will allow me to add components to it without actually changing the form itself. And then when I compile it, it adds into the database my extensions, and only my extensions will execute because it's referencing my data. So your system and your system and your system has no idea that I've put that extra field onto the form or into the database, right? And so that is how you get around this whole being able to share stuff with everybody in a shared deployment. And again, Microsoft dropped and discouraged the MorphX capabilities, and they added in a bunch of new debugger features as well. So previously, it was almost impossible to easily debug code that you had written in X++. Now, because it's done in Visual Studio, you get the full capabilities of the Visual Studio IDE. Now, as I mentioned before, the AOT, which is what actually is the visible structure of what the system looks like, is compiled and directly inserted into a database table, the database itself. And because of that, you also have access to the metadata around the database. So you get control of the structure and the layout of how the data inside the data store has been laid out. Now, what it does is that there are two different database files. The first database file is the actual data that you have, so your sales orders and all that sort of fun stuff. The other table, or the other database rather, is just the code, right? So that includes your extensions, the base configurations, and so on. And again, because it works a lot like Java, it's going to have a lot of the same Java, C#-ish type stuff. However, it does have less type safety, right? So if you're used to using Java and you're used to saying, okay, if I screw up, it's going to stop me from doing certain things, this won't. So you do need to be a little more careful when you're editing and debugging your code, that you're paying attention to things, in example, if statements. String handling is an open process, right? So as an example, strings may be delimited by either a single or double quotation mark, and comparisons are not case sensitive. So when you're setting all that up, you're not restricted. You could use one or the other. However, wherever you work and whichever, whether you're the customer side or a partner, I'm assuming you will have some sort of standardized rules around code formatting and processing and all that sort of stuff, at which point you would need to find. One of the confusing things is that it does use the plus sign for concatenation. And so the plus sign gets used in all sorts of different places and gets to be a bit confusing, because when you think you might be doing a mathematical thing, you might actually be putting two things together, and you don't realize it until after you've actually compiled it, and you look at the form and go, it doesn't work great. So you do need to be slightly careful around that. You have the ability to do local variable declarations, much like you would in a standard Java application. The switch statement is cool because it allows you to support multiple values and expressions in the same switch statement. Generally, in a switch statement in Java, it doesn't allow that, or it's very strict on how it handles that. In this, because of again, it's been sort of separated off, it does allow for a switch statement to have multiple expressions in it. The error handling is kind of funky. So the error handling is based on numerical values. When it generates an error and the compiler collects the error and generates the error statements to the user, it generally generates a numerical code. It's sort of along the line, well, because of the fact it's in SQL, it's sort of along the lines of when SQL generates an error message, right? How many of you have ever gotten the SQL 2586978411012 blah, 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 it's about 17 numbers long, and it goes, you have an error. And what's the error? It's like, go talk to your administrator. I am the damn administrator. Anyways, the same sort of thing happens here again because of the fact that it actually does live in the SQL database. All the errors that it generates and the exceptions are numerical error codes. Now, luckily, they've actually put some code in here to say, okay, if you get error 14, that means type mismatch, or error 17 means, you know, divide by 0 or something like that. So all of the code error messages are on the docs site on the web. And it's like about 75 pages worth of, of stuff, but you will be able to find any of the codes. I have only once came up where I found a numerical error code that made no sense, and it was because one of my coworkers was being a smartass and created this whole error thing that he knew would fail, and I'm sitting there looking at it going, right? So he was sitting over there giggling. I threw a shoe at him, but anyway. Friends. The other thing is that there is a retry statement that exists within the error handling, and we'll take a look at sort of an error handling code bracket in a few minutes. And it uses and acts like a go-to statement. So instead of breaking out of the code, it will actually give you the opportunity to say, I want to go to this other line and I'm going to handle it this way, so it doesn't always break out. One of the things that you will notice in Dynamics is that when you're doing stuff in the interface, you're constantly getting pop-ups with warning messages and all that sort of stuff. And some of that is driven by the error handling, and some of it is just the system saying, hey, this doesn't quite make sense, it doesn't add up. It doesn't mean it's a fault, it's just something to keep in mind when you're working in the system. And all of the code that executes is web-based. So in Dynamics 365, everything runs through the cloud. It all lives in Azure, and it all runs through whatever browser you're running on. There is no desktop application that you would be worrying about, that you're compiling for, that you're building for. Everything is web-based. Because of that, it gives you the capability of doing webby things like changing CSS styles and all that sort of stuff as well to make it display like your custom colors for your organization and pictures and all that sort of stuff as well. And like most other .NET applications, it does support inheritance and overrides as well. Now, some other elements that exist in the AOT. We have an X++ data type. These can either be primitive or composite. How do you guys, okay. I say composite. How do you, is it composite, composite? Like, because I'm Canadian English and not English yet, right? Okay, there you go, good. I'm not too far out. Although I still get the data and data one mixed up every once in a while, but whatever. So we have, again, all the extended data types that are all built on the primitive data types. And then again, extending them can make them bigger. So as an example, if you need to change a property for a label, you will create an extension of that property, make the modification, and then when it compiles, it'll execute the extended version rather than the built-in default one that comes with the page. Standard types that we have, Boolean, date, enums, GUID types, integers, time of day, UTC date times, that sort of thing. And again, the time of day one will depend on where you are and which deployment you have. One of the funny things is that there is a label file that actually comes in here which you could program for different locations. And in North America, it's called accounts payable and accounts receivable. Whereas here it's payable ledger and something else, or the labels are slightly different. And so I was looking for something one day and I couldn't find it. It's because I had the UK label file and I didn't know what all the differences were. And I was searching for this thing going, where the hell is it? And it took me about an hour to finally figure it out. But that's one of the things that you can actually programmatically change as well is the different labels and stuff. The advantage of doing that is that maintenance is much simpler. So in a normal environment where you would have an application that you install, Microsoft, let's say, would release a patch every month or every quarter, and you would have to download it and install it yourself and then do a compile. Microsoft does that for you now. Because it's a cloud-based application and it's shared, much like, let's say, Microsoft Office, if you're using Office Online, they do all of the firmware updates, they do all the monthly patching, they do all of that stuff for you, which again is why you can't change the base code and you have to have extensions. Because if you do change it, and then they come along and make a modification that makes or breaks your code, then you got to go through that whole process again, right? And so having the extension process makes it a lot easier. We have hierarchies for the extended data types. All of the base enumerations are assigned an integer, and they have the values for the labels and the names as an integer value that gets converted. And also, again, enums are probably the simplest thing in the system to extend. If you were actually taking the developer's course for this particular language, the first 2 chapters deals with extensions and enums. It's actually quite a simple process to be able to work with the system. There are some other properties that can get extended as part of the extensions. So labels, any of the help text or the form text. So as an example, the help text is, you click on the little question mark in the corner and it'll pull out the help files. The form help is every time you click on an item or you point to it, it'll pop up with a little box and it'll have an explanation of what's in there. That is all done programmatically. You could put data tags in. You can change the height and length of displays of things like forms or fields and so forth. You have the ability to show 0 values rather than just have them blanks. And you can also edit the number of decimals. If the number of decimals is extensible, then you would set it up as a real type and you'd have to set the value to yes to give you more than 10 decimal places. Otherwise, you're restricted to the 10 decimal places. So in the current release, all the developers use Visual Studio on their own systems, much like you would in a regular development scenario. You have DevOps, which is going to be used for your code repositories. So you'll download a local copy of the code, and you'll then be able to execute, and that will then get synchronized to your source control. Now, this is a little bit strange. In a normal development process, you will have Visual Studio installed on your desktop, on your computer. You'll download, you'll synchronize, you'll go in, you'll edit the code, you'll synchronize it back, and away you go. It doesn't work that way in Dynamics. You actually can only program it and develop within a version of the system that you download from Azure. It's a pre-configured VM that has the latest versions of Visual Studio Code, SQL Server, all that stuff. You actually end up running a localized VM of the entire Dynamics platform on a single VM. Okay? Now, you can either run it as an app in the Azure cloud, so you could just load it up as a VHD file in Azure, or you can download it to your desktop machine. But it doesn't actually download the whole database. What it does, and this is really funky, is that it converts the whole structure of the database into a number of INI files. How many of you are old enough to remember INI files? A few of us. Yeah. So really what it's doing is that it's simulating the database structure and the data content as a number of INI files that are existing on the system. And that's the only system that you have access to the actual database. So if you wanted to go into the AOT or you wanted to go into the database on that developer's VM, that's the only machine that you would have access to. Right? So once it goes into the sandbox or it goes into production, it's persona non grata. You cannot get access to it. There are very few situations where they will give you access, but you have to ask for access literally a month in advance, and they have to go through a security audit, and they have to validate why you need access for it, and then they may or may not give you access to it. It's just easier to download it as a VHD file. And when I'm teaching the classes for Dynamics, regardless of whether it's a finance course or development or whatever it is, every student gets their own VHD, which has basically the replica of the Contoso basic system in it that they can go and do their lab exercises on. The other advantage of doing it that way, again, is that it's quicker. You don't have to worry about anybody else breaking your stuff. And all the database changes get synchronized with the database at the time that you do the compile. Okay? So when you're in the compiler and you say, okay, I want to build this project or build this solution, after it goes through and does the code check and make sure that it's all syntactically correct and executes that component, it will do a synchronization of the database. If the synchronization of the database fails, it doesn't matter how well your code was, it won't show in the system because it didn't synchronize. The system executes the latest version that's only loaded in the database. So it doesn't matter what's in Visual Studio. If it never got sunk to the database, regardless of if it's in DevOps or whatever, it's not going to show or appear. And the data that lives there is its own copy. So you can actually have a copy of your production data, your physical purchase orders, purchase requisitions, invoices, all that stuff, in your VHD file so that you will be able to work with your own live data, but it's not really live, it's a replica copy of what's in the live production system. So let's take a look at it from the point of view of Visual Studio now. When we're looking in Visual Studio, we're going to create new projects, and you have to run Visual Studio as administrator, or you don't have access to the actual AOT, which is the application viewer, application explorer. So you do need to make sure that when you're actually executing Visual Studio, and it has to be 2015 or better, that you're running it as administrator. You'll get logged in, you'll be able to create a new project. In this case, we're going to create an unified operations application, which is based on D365. You're going to specify the name, the location, and the solution name, and click OK. This will create a new project, and it will add in all of the configured templates that go with D365 for you. And it'll take a few minutes to spark it up, and once it's up and running, you'll be able to go through and start doing your project. The framework version is normally 4.5.2. You can use a newer one, but Dynamics is based on 4.5.2, so that's generally what it defaults to. So in the application, this is what the AOT looks like. Okay? So it's broken out into data types, data models, code, user interfaces, analytics reports, business processes. There's about 25 different subsections that are broken out in the AOT. And you can work with it in either a classic view, which is sort of the old traditional Visual Studio view, or in the model view, which is what this is. And so this example here that you're looking at is the model view. These are all the models that are used. One of the other things that's different about X++ and Dynamics is that in a normal project, you would write a DLL file, you'd compile it, and you would install the DLL file to be executing. Here, if I want to compile code and import that into the solution, once I've got the solution built, I will then create what's called a model. That model file has the complete build of everything that you've done, including all of the base code that's in the system that you will then deploy, or Microsoft will deploy for you in a production environment. So you actually don't have the ability to do any of that stuff yourself. You have to actually get Microsoft to do all of that for you. So you could do your build, you could do all the testing, you can say, yep, thumbs up, it's ready to go, you've done all your UAT testing and all the rest of it, but you have to then notify Microsoft, and then they'll be the ones that actually promotes it to the production environments. Again, it's because everybody is sharing the same code base and platform, and so you need to make sure that everybody is playing nice in the sandbox. But from here, you'll be able to go in and create your different objects. On this hand side here, and I don't know why I didn't get a screenshot of it, it's got the standard Solution Explorer, so you can see all the different subsections, whether it's a form or a data field or what have you, and then be able to execute them. So again, as I mentioned, to deploy the code on your dev environment, you can just build this, do the build package. It'll execute locally because it synchronized the database. But once you're ready to actually go to a UAT environment for testing or into a production environment, anything that's shared, you'll create what's called a software deployable package, and that gets loaded up into a tool called Dynamics Lifecycle Services. That tool will then notify Microsoft that you're ready for doing the deployment, and it will then arrange a time and a date for you to then have that pushed for you. Generally, they will push to a UAT environment 2 weeks prior to what you would get to be pushed to the production environment. So that gives you 2 weeks to do your full regression testing and smoke testing and all that sort of stuff to make sure that nothing's broken. If you find in that time that nothing is broken, as long as you give them 12 hours notice to stop the deployment, they will continue on. Okay, so if you give them 12 hours notice, they'll give you an extension to do your deployment. If you don't give them that 12 hours notice, whether you've done testing or not, it's going, right? So that there's a good chance it might break your deployment. One of the things that I tell people when they're going from the on-prem version to the cloud version is that your job doesn't go away. A lot of people worry that when you go to the cloud, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job because Microsoft's going to do everything now. No, your job doesn't go away, it just changes. You go from being a day-to-day administrator and making sure people can log in and all that sort of stuff to being a test administrator and a test manager to make sure that everything is working properly whenever changes are being completed, and they change monthly. So if you decide that you want to do a manual synchronization of the database, again, under D365, so in the top menus, there'll be a D365 subsection. You can right-click on, or you can go into it, and one of the options that you'll have is synchronizing of the database. You also have the capability of here to import an existing project, build a model that you've built, and deploy that model. Again, this deployment is only to your local system, but that deployment will then synchronize everything, and you can go through and at least do your own testing locally on your development box before you put it out into a wider test box or UAT environment. The last box, the last point there is important. When you're dealing with SQL errors, a good first shot is to synchronize the database. So if for whatever reason, when you're trying to do testing or whatever, it's throwing SQL Server error messages, just do a database resync, and that hopefully will fix the problem, and you'll be able to continue on. Another component that's existing that's been an add-in for Dynamics is something called the Element Designer, and this is basically a contextual way for you to build and modify things like forms. A form might have multiple screens. It might have a header view at the top, and it might have a set of rows like a table at the bottom, that sort of stuff. And so the Element Designer basically is a drag and drop tool that will let you add components. If you remember what Access used to look like, where you could sit and drag things into Access and it would create the form for you, it works along the same sort of modifications that the Access tool did. This becomes what's referred to as your working space, right? You have to be careful. If you have a bigger monitor than most of your users, if you think about when web design first started, people were like, I got a really big monitor, and you do your development at a high resolution, and then you would deploy it and somebody would have a much lower resolution and they'd lose half the screen, right? The same sort of thing can happen here. So do be careful that when you're setting things like form sizes and table sizes and so forth, that you do set them to be dynamic so that they will change with the page. Again, the model is a group of elements. So this is all of the source files, the metadata, everything that needs to go in, including the customizations that you've created and the extensions that need to be deployed into the system. And really a model is just a group of projects. So it's a number of projects that have been all compiled together, that the compile component knows that each one will work against each other and that not one of them is breaking any of the other projects in it. And then that gets used to deploy into the greater application itself. Models are mandatory. You cannot create anything without a model to get for deployment. If there's no model, it don't go. And so this again is done through the create model wizard that exists in finance and operations. Also in the lifecycle services, which is how you manage your deployments, there is a server there called a build server. That build server will also allow you to create the models as well, because that'll have a direct connection between the DevOps server that has the finalized tested code from the developers and merge that all into one big build. It is possible also to modify a model after you've created it. So as an example, let's say you need to create a reference to it. You've created a new page and you need to reference that page. It's just a matter of just rebuilding the model. You don't have to go through the whole process again because it already exists. You just need to compile the form that you've modified with the reference, add it back in, and then just build the model, and it'll recreate everything. So here's an example of the language. Okay, so we've got In this example, we're going to do an update to a table, and the table amount is going to be increased by 100, and the table account number is 1050, and we're going to do an update to the table, and we're going to commit it, right? So basically, this is saying whatever the value is that's in there, I'm going to add it by 100, and it's going to be to that account number, and then I'm going to save it, right? So it's really straightforward. It uses a combination of you know, as I say, standard sort of Java, C#, and a connection of the SQL database, the SQL code, and it will then allow you to merge that information. Here's another example. So in this example here, this will integrate a secondary SQL query into my code. And there's 3 examples of this. So I'm going to show you 3 different versions. The first is the one that you would be using for a performance enhancement. So this is the way that you would do it to make sure it would work properly. The second 2 examples work, but they're more in an object-like behavior. So in this example, we're specifying, much like we did in the last one, our user information, and then we're going to update our records and set the information to admin and enable it. In this example, we're doing it through a while loop. And in this example, we're using a where clause in the SQL database. So here, this is the most efficient. This one is not so bad, but it does do a loop through there until it finds the correct account. And then this one is actually generating a SQL query that you'll have to ship over to the SQL database, run the SQL query, and then pull the information out, which is the least efficient of all of them. If you're going to do that, you should write this component as a stored procedure in SQL and then execute the stored procedure. You still with me? All right, so a few other things about the language. The compile, again, has direct access to the database metadata. And again, this is just a repeat of the previous slide that has all of that information just to kind of rehash it. All of the standard operators, so we have all the assignment operators, all the standard arithmetic operators, standard relational database operators, and then any ternary or other operators for succinct if-else statements, right? So result equals x is not equal to 5, yes or no, right? If x is equal to 5, then it's yes. If it's not, then it's no. So that's how you would write the query to actually be able to determine a value for it. There are, again, the different base types that we have in the system. And then we can compose data using a number of different features. We can do it either as an array, a container. We could do it as classes, set up delegates, or create a new table and host the data that way. And then also, again, all of these user-defined data types are based on whatever primitive data types that you have here. So you can use any of these and create your own user-defined data types. From a constructs point of view, we use standard method modifiers, private, protected, and public. And again, you can execute within the visibility of a class, subclass, or at the public level. And methods can be either a specific instance method or an object method. In either case, it must be instantiated. You can have static methods or class methods. And depending upon which you're using, you would do the double colon structure so that you could identify them. From a SQL Server point of view, these are the standard SQL commands and SQL syntax that you would use in X++. And so it goes through and gives you all of the standard select statements and then how you would set the parameters for all of them. This, again, I'll update the slide deck to Slack so you can download it if you're having a lack of able to sleep tomorrow. Conditional statements, standard formatting for conditional statements. And again, you can use different queries or different formats, commands within this, the single conditional statement. So here we've got if-else statements, switch statements or case statements, depending upon which language you're used to, and iterative statements with breaks in them if you want to break out of a command. Okay, we also have the ability to set constants. And again, obviously a constant is a value that doesn't change. And it works the same as every other .NET language. You just specify that you're creating a constant, the constant data type, and then whatever value you're associating to it. System functions. Again, these are types of functions that can be executed in the system with code. And these are the types of data functions that you can execute, or system functions, so you can do standard business operations. As an example, let's say that when you execute a confirmed purchase order, you want to notify the vendor ahead of time that this purchase order is on their way, especially if it's a rather large order. And so you would create a business rule or a business operation that when the purchase order is confirmed, it will generate the business rule, execute it to Power Automate as an example, which will then send an email to the appropriate vendor, which it extracts out of the business event and says, hey, you're going to get this purchase order, just to let you know that it's on its way. So that's an example of a business operation. Container operations include loading data. This is generally for large data operations imports. Data conversions, that could be as much as using currency. It could be going from pallets to bins or liters to gallons or whatever the conversions happen to be. Any of the data operations that are existing, mathematical operations, reflections within the system, and any session functions or string operations. Again, all of those can be managed and run with code. And again, as I mentioned previously, it all interacts with other .NET languages. So as an example, you could create a reference to a C# class library that exists external to the system, but plugs into it through an extension. So you do have that capability of using other languages as well. Because it is object-oriented, it follows all of the same principles that object-oriented programming completes. It does differ slightly from languages such as C# in that any downcasting is done via keyword management. Method overloading is not supported in this platform. Method overriding is supported, but method overloading is not. Parameters can be optional, and they can have default values associated to them. And a class can only be explicitly extended by one class, right? So you can't extend it to multiple classes. It's sort of a one-to-one relationship. Attributes, you have the capability of selecting attributes based on its metadata for the class or the method. So here we've got a class that's bicycle that's based off of an existing component. And there's another feature in here called chain of ownership or chain of command. This is used for class extensions, and it allows you to set up how you're going to customize the standard classes, right? How you're basically going to hook the classes together so that they'll work properly. And again, all of this is done through code. And in the Solution Explorer, they'll always begin with _extension. And so if you open it up in the actual code editor, it will say extension of, and then whatever it's extending, so that it knows that it's extension rather than the base component. Again, scoping can be done public, protected, or private. If you use private or protected, internal is by using the class keyword, so you can only access information within the same model. Or if you set it as public, you could use it between different components and different models if you needed to. So some best practices. Best practices, again, there is a best practice tool that's built in. And what it does is that it goes through and it'll look at your code and literally tell you if you're being good, okay? So the best practices component, it allows you to make sure that your code is less prone to errors. It makes sure that it's easy to modify if it does get errors or does define errors in the system. And it's really useful when it's doing the compile, okay? Because at the component or at the compile component part, if the best practice doesn't pass, you actually could fail the model build and deployment into the greater system, right? Microsoft will actually check the BP to check the status of it when they go to deploy your model to make sure that your code does actually follow best practices. And again, this will check to make sure that all of your correct options are selected in Visual Studio. So as an example, you may have forgotten to select a library for a form, right? And so you were trying to create it. There needs to be some sort of a reference. You didn't notice the mistake or the error during the build phase and on your own local machine, and so it didn't occur to you. And so this will go through and validate that, hey, yeah, you've missed this library. You need to make sure that you have this library added before it'll be passing the best practices. It also has the ability to be added via code. So you can use a code method to execute the best practice tool, and that way it'll execute every time you do the compile. And it'll run behind the scenes, and it doesn't have any depreciable negligence on the system. It's not going to slow it down to any level. And you also have the ability to suppress it via code as well. So you can either execute it or suppress it based on how you're going to call that particular code. All of the build processes or best practices are checked when the build is executed. Again, as mentioned before, it'll test to make sure that you are following best practices. Again, might be as simple as you're missing an index on something. And lastly, you can specify that DevOps will be set so that it will not allow any merges unless best practice has been executed. Okay? Or if there are best practice errors, it won't allow you to do any database merging or data merging into DevOps. That is the default, by the way, for Dynamics, is that it won't let you merge unless best practice is enabled and passed. And that is it. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be here for a bit. Take care. I didn't hear any snoring.